Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Lowdown. Today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Richard Albert, Head of Capital Investment Sector for the UK Government. Richard, big warm welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Connor. It's great to be on.
Richard, I was delighted to meet you down in Miami not too long ago, just before the Christmas when the weather was a lot nicer. A fantastic week, meeting a hub of global stakeholders. What was your biggest takeaway from the week there?
I thought it was fantastic. I think my biggest takeaway was just how huge um, football industry has become and how diversified it has become. We had, sessions at that conference on, everything from player welfare to sports science to investing in clubs, media, extracting more advertising revenue, stadium and training facility design and construction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just, it was fantastic, and it's amazing the array of speakers and attendees that it attracts. And it's just what a great way to spend 3 days and nights, I have to say.
Great excuse, yeah. Very
Yeah.
important to include the nights there, Richard. And I think it's very pertinent to what we're both doing in the field today. But as we begin and as is opening tradition on the podcast, let's bring it back to the very start, Richard. Could you please take us through your earliest football memory?
Well, given my age, we're going to be going way back. um, I've had a love and passion for sport in general all my life. And in terms of background, I was born and raised in Boston, so in the US. And my father introduced me to sport, both playing and following, from an extremely young age. Like 2 or 3 years old, are my first memories of playing and starting to develop an interest in sport. And even my extended family, whenever we would kind of get together for family gatherings, I would always be in the room with the men watching the games on the telly while my siblings and cousins would be elsewhere in the house, playing with toys or whatever. But of course, that was the big four North American sports. So American football, baseball, hockey, basketball. For me, soccer, football was the first one that was sort of self-discovered. And my first memory, I think, goes back to 1970. There was a program on US sport called ABC's Wide World of Sports, and they showed kind of, this is a great example of how far football has come in the US. They showed like little highlights of the 1970 World Cup final between Brazil and Italy, which was kind of an iconic match in the history of football. And I was just really kind of enraptured by it. And so, I went to the library and I took a book out to learn the rules of football, and tried to take the lead on the school playground to organize pickup matches, with my mates, which was an absolute disaster, probably like the highest instance of handballs ever called in a single match anywhere ever in the world. And by the sort of mid-70s, on PBS, our public broadcasting channel, they started showing ITV's The Big Match from the previous weekend on the following Wednesday evening. So for the first time, I got to see English club football and just absolutely fell head over heels in love with it. And it was, so information about it was so rare, so scarce on the ground, that I had to go to, there was a news agent in Harvard Square called Out of Town News, which basically did exactly as it said on the tin, right? It sold newspapers and magazines from around the world. And I would just kind of just buy up all the English football magazines I could find, Shoot and 90 Minutes and World Soccer in those days. And then, of course, around that time, it was the kind of peak of the old North American Soccer League. So my friends and I used to kind of take the subway in to watch the New England T-Men, who were Boston team in the league at that time. And yeah, and of course I had a chance to see some of the great players of that era, like Franz Beckenbauer and Carlos Alberto and Johan Neeskens, playing in the league. But it was really only when I moved to Europe that kind of transformed everything for me. In 1988, I did part of my MBA studies in Madrid. So, I mean, I got to go to the Bernabeu Real Madrid play, and every day I would buy, the daily Spanish sports newspapers, Marca and AS, just to kind of, brush up on my Spanish. And then I moved to Europe permanently for work in 1990, and I was first in Slovakia, so I'd go see Slovan Bratislava play. Then I was in Brussels for a year and a half and became an Anderlecht supporter and used to go see them play home and away. And then in 1993, moved to London, and always in my 20 years living in London, I always lived within walking distance of Stamford Bridge. And so I think I arrived on a Sunday, January 30th. And then the next day went to a match at the bridge and hooked for life. Long-term season ticket holder, still a club member, still go to matches ever since the time I'm back in London, and still follow them passionately to this day.
Amazing how that sense of adventure from a young age, preceded what was a global tour, really, and led to kind of a cross-pollination of experiences, which ultimately helped shape the trajectory of your career. And it's interesting speaking to people like yourself on this podcast. And, I think you can eloquently speak to this too, because meant you could say the quintessential, the typical English football fan versus the typical American sports fan could be quite dogmatic in their beliefs of how sports should be structured, how they should be governed and whatnot. So I'd say going from the likes of Spain to a Belgium to an England must have been eye-opening for what was a young student at the time, seeing how sport is kind of received in all these different countries.
Absolutely. And I think as somebody who, grew up with not a lot of financial means. I mean, we never really traveled anywhere as a family. I think the first time I got an airplane was spring break, sophomore year university. First time I ever left the country was a road trip with some of my mates to Montreal. So I always kind of had that global bug in me, from a just sort of general cultural and lifestyle perspective and history and everything else, and definitely sport. And that's actually one of the great things. I think sport's one of the great levelers in the world. Like, you can be anywhere, talking to anyone of any sort of strata of society, whatever they do for an occupation, taxi driver, somebody working in a bar, or a colleague in the business world, and you can always, have a great conversation, break down barriers by having an engaged conversation about sport and football in particular. And I have so many kind of anecdotal memories throughout the years in various parts of the world, and, having those kind of conversations. And that's what makes it so special.
And it's interesting because you speak there about breaking down preconceived barriers, and I'd imagine even in most imaginative young mind couldn't have begun to foresaw the role in which you imbue today. And I imagine it's a role which can be quite broad indeed. It is spread out over a multitude of industries such as health, life sciences, tech, and sport. How would you best describe that role, Richard?
Well, in terms of the remit, so again, to kind of restate title, so I'm head of capital investment for the UK government in North America. So, what does that mean? It means I'm working with the world's major private investors, so across all kind of relevant categories: private equity firms, venture capital firms, real estate investment trusts, public sector pension funds, university endowments, insurance companies, and so on, to promote and support the deployment of capital into sectors of the UK economy and society that are of utmost strategic significance and kind of in line with government priorities. So you mentioned a few. It spans things like kind of the key industries of the 21st century, like life sciences and deep tech, but also things like renewable energy, and critical infrastructure, and affordable housing, and so on, and sport, because the reality is that sport is one of the most globally prominent and successful sectors of the UK economy, and predominantly driven by football. And so kind of the mandate is kind of driven, I think, by sort of two kind of overarching objectives. And one, of course, is to continue to support the prosperity and growth of the sector, but at the same time, to also try to drive and support the establishment of a much more solid footing of long-term financial sustainability for sport. And how so you say, what's the role for government in that? And I think it's like two ways, and kind of one's kind of sort of a carrot and one's in a way kind of a stick, but both with the same sort of positive intent. And the first one, of course, is to attract world-class investors, and not just deep pools of capital that are going to help to support short-term cash flow requirements of the clubs, but also investors that bring kind of deep management expertise and broad global networks that will allow the clubs to critically unlock and diversify new sources of revenue growth, which are absolutely fundamental to the kind of long-term financial sustainability of the sport. And as government, as we're now starting to potentially intervene in probably in a more bold way than pretty much sort of any other free market government, I think, has ever done in the history of sport, through the potential establishment of an independent regulator for football. At the same time, we need to ensure that whatever regulations are put in place, that it does nothing to impede our ability to continue to attract the world's best talent into English football, I think, both in the boardroom and on the pitch, because those are really the keys to its success.
It's been quite illuminating to see how this whole movement has unfolded, Richard, and I'm sure, as you know more than most, it's been quite prevalent over the past few years. And for the purposes of this discussion, we'll of course narrow it down to football, but the amount of US investors in English football, namely the Premier League now, where both I heard you speak about before, up to 50%, if not more now, of Premier League clubs have US business interests. Bar the obvious kind of commercial upside and whatnot, what are some of the reasons as to why these investors are incentivized to invest in the English game?
Well, I mean, I think, again, it starts, of course, from having a very successful and attractive asset, right? So the Premier League is the most watched sports league in the world, full stop. Any sport, any country, anywhere. And so, whilst the games are being played on a stage in England, it's a global audience, right? And every single week, your asset is getting exposure to hundreds of millions of consumers in pretty much every country in the world, across, developed economies and developing economies. And these are all potential consumers for you to be able to grow and diversify your revenue. And so as a result, I mean, it's unsurprising that the Premier League is in terms of revenue generation, is the number one football league in the world by far, and even the championship. So the second tier down, I think, is the number 6 in terms of revenue generation across the world. So more than the top leagues elsewhere in Europe, so more than the top leagues in Holland, Belgium, Portugal, Turkey, etc., more than the league in Mexico or any other leagues in Latin America or MLS. And investors, of course, are looking for ways to generate unrealized value. And I think that there's kind of that halo effect, right? In that you have the most entertaining product. Why? Because you're attracting the world's best talent on the pitch. And of course, that hasn't always been the case, right? If you go back to the late 80s, early 90s, it was Serie A in Italy that attracted the world's best playing talent. I'm not so sure if they attracted the world's best investors or the best talent in the boardroom. Then in the early part of the 21st century, it was La Liga in Spain, but it is the Premier League now, at the forefront and absolutely running away with it. And not only, do we have the most entertaining product on the pitch, but we also have some of the most iconic brands in world sport, not just in football. And of course, they're the historical ones like Manchester United, Liverpool, Arsenal, but obviously, of course, Chelsea, Manchester City, given the exposure that they've had, basis of their periods of long-term continued success. But even clubs like, Fulham, Burnley, Bournemouth, Aston Villa are still getting that same degree of exposure every week. And I think and the asset values, of course, are lower than some of the other clubs that I mentioned. And so they have the ability to kind of have lower entry cost and still be able to take advantage of that revenue generation upside. And I think, at a macro level, the UK also is one of the world's largest economies. So we have a huge domestic economy, one of the world's leading democracies with a strong rule of law, and particularly institutional investors have a great familiarity with the market. Most of them have offices in London and fairly substantial presence in the UK. So it's very easy for them to make commitments to English football, I think, versus other leagues. And the fact that it's in English, I think, also helps a lot, especially from an American investor perspective. And I think if you compare them to, say, some of the other emerging destinations for investment in sport, I think what we have in England means a lot, and that is kind of tradition and history, right? If you're one of the world's top players, you want to be playing at Old Trafford and Anfield, in Wembley. You want to be participating in competitions like the FA Cup. You don't want to be playing in a half-empty stadium in the desert. And it's not just also even a handful of clubs, right? So, part of the problem in the other European leagues is, they're basically, to use an economic term, they're oligopolies, right? How many years have Bayern Munich won Bundesliga in a row? Was it now 11, 12? I've lost count. PSG in France, there's always been the duopoly in Spain, but there's so much more parity in England, and also a lot more depth. You go to a match in the football league, so in the lower divisions, and you're still getting crowds of 20, 30, in some cases 40,000. So, outdrawing top leagues elsewhere in Europe. And that's why players are attracted to come there. It's not just the money. And that's why I think investors like to be seen, to be kind of part of that ecosystem. So I think much more than some of the other emerging destinations.
And I think it's suffice to say it's not only the world's best players that want to compete in the Premier League, it's also the world's leading investors. And of course, you deal with an awful lot of them that come to the UK. And by product of the economies of scale that they bring is obviously, world-class managerial practices. And it's always a conundrum, isn't it, in English football, Richard, as you know best, in terms of marrying off the pitch with what happens on it. In recent years, how much or how have these executives have had to kind of tap into that extensive knowledge and leverage those best practices to essentially grow what's happening on the pitch and off it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think, and I'll be careful on this one. That's why I do think that there are the areas that you specifically mentioned are probably areas where the major professional leagues in the US have been a lot more advanced than kind of the major football leagues in Europe, where the sport just is what it is organically, right? And it's always going to command tremendous interest and attention of supporters, consumers, brands who want to advertise, media who want to cover it. I think so in a way it's kind of, I mean, especially if you want to go way back, and if you think about the utter contempt that owners in the past had for their supporters, I mean, it was very much rooted in the old class system. Just herded into standing pens behind the goal, and no element of duty of care with regards to health and safety, never mind the fan experience. But the world has changed, right? And people have so many more options, and sadly shorter attention spans, and without wanting to generalize, particularly more so in younger generations. And so the competition is just not about what happens on the pitch, but you're competing against other forms of entertainment and other activities from a leisure perspective that take people's time, and I think that so much more emphasis needs to be placed in those areas. I mean, if you look at the financial statement of a football club, I mean, there's basically three critical drivers, right? So the main source of revenue is broadcast revenue. The main source of cost is player salaries, and the biggest value asset that you own is the stadium and the land that it sits on. And all three of those areas, I think, are where the latest wave of investors are spending the most time, energy, and effort focusing on. And I think for good reason, right? So, I mean, on the broadcast side, I think we all can see, like in real time, the kind of continued disruption and the accelerated decline of traditional linear broadcasters. I mean, obviously the disruption is coming from technology. It's coming from the changing demographics of the audience. Now, in spite of that, the value of the latest UK domestic TV deal for the Premier League was its biggest ever. I think it's the same as well for the four major leagues in North America. Why? Because even given all of those other options, live sports still commands the greatest television audiences throughout the world, and therefore are attracting the greatest value for advertisers, and then gives the broadcasters, more incentive to invest more, and then it gives them the rights holders greater stream of revenue. But that's not the case everywhere. In France, Ligue 1, has had a decrease in the value of their latest television contract versus the previous one. I think it's the same with Serie A in Italy. And so the battle for international streaming rights is going to get more and more intensive. And I think just even in general, the kind of shift to streaming, both domestically and internationally, is going to create a much bigger pie for the rights holders at top line. Now that's fantastic. But then if we start talking about the kind of continued prosperity and financial sustainability of the sport, the cost structure also needs to be addressed in a different way than it has in the past. So in the Premier League, the average ratio of player salaries to top line revenue is 70%. Tottenham are best in class at 40%, but they are really an outlier. In the Championship, it is over 100%. So for every pound of revenue they bring in the door, more than that is going out the door in player salaries. Now, I cannot think of a more dysfunctional core economic model. I cannot think of another industry anywhere that pays more in employee salaries than they generate in revenue. A hard salary cap, North America, is going to be extremely difficult, I think, to implement because of the global playing field. And that's, I think, one of the things that has come out of the consultation on the creation of the independent regulator is that, we can't do things in England in isolation, because then we lose that global competitiveness. But I do think that football needs to do more than financial fair play, the way it's structured today, I think is only entrenching the disparity in wealth from the haves, between the haves and the have-nots. And as a result, as we were just talking about earlier, in terms of results on the pitch and the standings and the tables, a less competitive product. So I think that the new wave of investors, I think, understand all of that. All of those represent potential areas to kind of unlock value. So like I mentioned, sort of, the biggest asset being stadiums and the real estate they sit on. Again, that's another area where North America is way far advanced than what has traditionally been the case in the UK and Europe in terms of optimizing that asset. So generating more match day revenue, whether it's kind of more corporate hospitality, more premium seating, better food and drink options, merchandising, all that, and also greater utilization of the asset on non-match days through hosting events and conferences and having retail tenants on your property and hospitality on property and so on.
And of course, Richard, we were just speaking about obviously the upgrades being made off the pitch. It's reminiscent of what really is a changing investment landscape, and it's very dynamic. You spoke about the introduction of the independent regulator, and evidently a huge part of your own remit now is the education piece. And for me, it's interesting. As in prep for this podcast, I was listening to you in a previous one speak about you have some of these investors coming from the NFL, which is akin to socialism for billionaires, to the Premier League, that is quote unquote endless capitalism. To aid and to educate these big wily investors in their strategic decision making, what would you say is the one kind of key thing that seems to be overlooked continuously?
Well, I think there's no reason why any of these sophisticated investors shouldn't be sufficiently well versed in the very different structure and dynamics of English football versus North American sport, whether they are existing owners or not in North American sport, right? Because if you think about, if you're talking about the world's largest private equity firms, or even, their senior partners that lead the firms, major venture capital firms and pension funds and so on. I mean, they're investing in a very broad, diversified portfolio of asset types across a very broad and diversified spectrum of industry verticals, right? So, and across, multiple geographies throughout the world, right? So this is what they do for a living, right? And they, if they're going to be investing in a port in Colombia or a high-speed rail network in China or residential housing in Scotland, they need to do their homework, right? They need to do their due diligence on the sector, on government policy and strategy, on the regulatory environment, on the dynamics, on the competitive landscape, and so on, right? But it's really interesting how in an industry sector like sport, they just, in a way, I'm not going to say, like, they kind of get, in a way, kind of almost carried away with the emotion of it, right? So it's, it's a very, very different investment, right? And if you're going to invest in a port in Colombia, provided you've got sufficient experience in running a port, you should do well, and provided you made the right investment decision up front and you're investing in an economy where the regulatory environment is conducive to the profitable operation of that, and there aren't constraints, and you've got a competitive advantage and you can grow, you should be successful. With football, I mean, you're investing in an asset where there's an element that you can't control, and that is, 22 players on the pitch, and trying to win matches. And I think sometimes they get either kind of say too emotional about it or too complacent about it, and kind of make the false assumption that it's what worked in North America is going to work in England, and what works in the NFL or the NBA or the NHL is going to work in the Premier League or in the Championship. But there are so many, I mean, absolutely fundamental differences in that structure, right? So again, to kind of bring it back to investing in other asset types and in other verticals, I mean, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't invest in high-speed rail in China without knowing, kind of what the economics are and what the regulatory environment is and what the government's position on it and what the risks are and where the potential upside is. But in football, in many cases, they don't, right? And so, and I'm sure they know, obviously, basic things, right? They know that it's not these aren't franchises, right? They are clubs, that their existence and which league they're playing in is 100% dependent upon the performance on the pitch, right? It is a complete meritocracy. There's no promotion and relegation. I think they understand that because that kind of grabs the headlines, but then below that, like, you don't have salary cap. You don't have collective bargaining with players unions, and you set an agreement, and that's in place for a term of whatever, 4 or 5 years, and brings that level of stability. You don't have that. The global dimension of the sport. So if you're one of the world's best basketball players, the only league you're ever going to play in or want to play in is the NBA. If you're one of the world's best hockey players, you're only going to want to play in the NHL. If you're one of the world's best footballers, you have limitless options, basically, of where you play. So, how they manage that, I think, is a bit of a shocker in some cases for them. The portability of clubs, of course, is a huge one, right? Because in the in the North American leagues, where the leagues themselves are run by the owners for the benefit of the owners. They're being led by a commissioner who is hired by the owners to look after the best interests of the owners, and so that they make the most money that they possibly can. They don't want competition, right? They, in most leagues, a core element of that is geographic exclusivity. So you don't want somebody else encroaching on your territory. Compare that to London, for example, where you have 15 professional clubs just in the top 4 leagues of the pyramid. And so, that's an element of competition for revenue generation, as well as for playing talent, that I think is alien to them. The clubs own their stadia in England for the most part, with a couple of examples of, again, reasons why we're looking to create the independent regulator. In North America, in many cases, it's underwritten by taxpayer money. And because the owners, basically have all the leverage, they can, in effect, blackmail local government to say, unless you fork over taxpayer money to build a new stadium, I'm just going to pack up the club and move it somewhere else where they'll do that for me. And of course, that can't happen in England. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that I think they don't realize when they start kind of expressing an interest in wanting to invest. And so I think it's kind of incumbent upon us, government, and I think me, particularly when I'm engaging with these investors, to kind of start by educating them on the differences, so that they have a better understanding about, what they're potentially getting into.
It's very, very interesting, and it can nearly make the most wisest men incandescent at times as to how the allure of the Premier League carrot always prevails over over the Premier League stick. And sometimes the emotion, makes people run away and do some crazy things, such as buying more than one club. It's estimated nowadays that there's over 250 clubs worldwide that are all part of MCOs, inevitably, which will raise governance concerns.
Indeed. So, I mean, I think in terms of why we're seeing an explosion of them, I think from both a football operations perspective, as well as from a financial perspective, there are a lot of attractive elements of owning a multi-club portfolio, right? So on the football operations side, I mentioned earlier that the most valuable asset that a club has on their books is the stadium and the real estate that it sits on. But their other most valuable assets, of course, are their players. And having a multi-club portfolio expands the opportunity from a player development perspective, right? So clubs can invest in bringing in more young talent, either through purchasing them or bringing them through their academies. And, rather than having them, as squad member 23 or 24 and spending most of their time sitting on the bench or up in the stands and not developing, being able to move them to one of the other clubs in the portfolio, either lower down the pyramid or in another country, at least gives them, quality playing time in a competitive league and helps to facilitate their ongoing development. And in many cases, they can wind up bringing them back to the parent club, or if not, selling them on in most cases for a profit. So from a football perspective and from a financial perspective, that makes a lot of sense. Now, from a governance perspective, it's going to get very, very tricky, right? And we've started to see the first instances of that when you have clubs from the same ownership group playing each other in European competition. And the big difference, of course, and we've been kind of joking about investors, getting stars in their eyes when they look to invest in football. But part of the reason why football supporters as consumers are so why that demand is so inelastic, right? You can change your name, you can change your nationality, you can change your spouse, your gender, your nose, anything, pretty much anything, but you can't change your football club, right? And part of the reason that it's so sticky is because of that kind of tribal competitiveness that we have as humans, and that's what differentiates football from other forms of entertainment is you don't know the outcome, right? You're not going to, see a concert where the lyrics to the songs and pretty much how the song's going to end. If there's even a suspicion that the result is, not completely above board, and that owners have a conflict of interest and can make personnel decisions that are going to influence the result or give the perception that it's going to influence results. I mean, I think that is a big issue. And the preponderance of this happening is even going to be more so as you start to see some of these multi-ownership groups, expand more broadly geographically. And at the same time, you also have expanding international club competitions like Club World Cup, for example, where, again, you can reasonably foresee instances where teams within the same ownership group are going to be qualifying for what FIFA are trying to establish as the kind of premier club competition in world football. And that the time to address that is I think is rapidly approaching.
And it's interesting because we speak about, very stuff that's quite pertinent, and it's changing the investment landscape as we know it. When we speak about certainty, we must also evaluate the uncertainty that is the European Super League, that we thought was actually dead and buried after their announcement in December. However, according to Spanish newspapers last night, it looks like it could be back on the cards indeed. And inevitably, that factors into your field too, Richard, because it would evoke some potential disruption that could bring an end to English football as we know it. To your best knowledge and the investors that you're dealing with on a daily basis, to what extent are they accurately assessing this risk?
Well, okay, so I'll actually start with the government line on this, right? So the potential creation of an independent regulator for football actually arose from a fan-led review that was commissioned by the UK government a few years ago, coming out of the pandemic and most importantly, the potential creation of the European Super League and the tremendous backlash that generated. And so one of the core elements of the independent regulator's mandate will be to prohibit English clubs from joining breakaway competitions. And I think that is a component where there is, I would say, almost unanimity of support across all key stakeholders within the industry in England. And I would say that, I mean, maybe it wasn't initially, but I would say also including the owners of the clubs that, you know, initially were, you know, potentially going to be part of that. I mean, I think that was a cold, hard lesson that they experienced when they saw the kind of depth of the passion of the kind of abhorrence to this. Because, you know, unlike in the US, you know, where you don't have promotion and relegation, where you don't have international club competitions, whereas, as I mentioned earlier, your only right to be there is based upon a meritocratic system that you're good enough to qualify to be in it. And, you know, yes, that brings an element of additional risk. I mean, for those that are potentially in danger of relegation, I mean, that has other, I think, ramifications to way the economics of English football are structured. So, you know, part of the reason that you have, you know, what called parachute payments and have been in place for some time is to try to cushion the impact of dropping that considerable drop from the Premier League to the Championship. Now, what that I think is inadvertently resulted in is kind of a tranche of, you know, so-called yo-yo clubs who are cushioned by those parachute payments when they go down to the Championship, and therefore there's actually now probably a greater disparity in the financial wherewithal of the yo-yo clubs compared to the rest of the Championship clubs versus, say, the drop from the Premier League to the Championship. And so another part of the potential mandate of the regulator could be to actually intervene and arbitrate a settlement on greater revenue share between the Premier League and the Football League, to ensure that gulf doesn't grow. Because, as I mentioned earlier, like one of the great things that I think differentiates English football versus leagues in other countries is the depth of quality and the parity on the pitch, which makes for a more exciting competition. So yeah, you can mention, yeah, of course, there was the ruling by the European Court of Justice back at the end of November. Could we reasonably say that the European Super League is back on the table? I mean, you know, what did Alexander Seferin say? Like, you know, good luck. You know, I look forward to watching a league of two clubs. And so I think it is, I mean, you can if you are Real Madrid, Barcelona, Juventus, Bayern Munich, Paris Saint-Germain, you can understand why there would be appetite for it. You could argue that de facto, the Premier League is in essence become the European Super League. It is the league that's attracting the most investment, and it's the league that's generating the greatest audiences and the most followers and attracting the most talent. So I think the imperative to do so from the English clubs is not there. And I also think that people who buy into the English football understand the benefit of the way our system works. So I don't see that necessarily as being the biggest threat. I mean, I think the biggest threat, as I mentioned, I think is that England becomes, there is less competitive than it historically has been, in that gulf between the haves and the have-nots continues to grow. And I think that that's really, you know, one of the key reasons why there is such support, and amazingly in an incredibly polarized political environment, this is the football governance bill looks to be one piece of legislation that has strong cross-party support. So I'm very positive that it will become law in the lifetime of this current parliament. And because so we have something that's incredibly valuable on a global basis, and I think it's imperative that all the key stakeholders in that equation understand our kind of collective responsibility to preserve that.
It's absolutely fascinating. And, I can imagine, aside from your general role and responsibilities, how exciting a day today must be. In fact, kind of with one eye in the past, another eye in the present, and indeed, casting a vision towards the future. Richard, what trends or what changes to investment dynamics potentially excite you that we should all keep an eye upon in the forthcoming years?
Sure. I mean, I think, in and of itself, the kind of changing complexion of investor types into football is incredibly exciting, right? So, I mean, the past 5 years has probably seen the most dramatic evolution in football's history, right? So for the first 100 years, it was all the teams were basically owned by local benefactors who, typically were, one of the wealthiest individuals in a particular town or city. And often they also owned a company that was the biggest employer, and they were lifelong supporters of the club, and owning the local football club was a means of kind of investing back in the community and, somewhat altruistic, maybe somewhat egotistical, but whatever. I mean, that it was, very local, right? Then, 2003, when Roman Abramovich bought Chelsea, I mean, that was probably the most significant watershed in terms of the development of and the evolution of the economics of football, and particularly in England, because I mean, obviously, it changed, I think, two things dramatically. One, the global aspect of it. You now had a Russian oligarch owning a club in central London. And it also, it signals the shift from millionaire owners to billionaire owners, and from high net worth individuals to ultra high net worth individuals, or ultra high net worth individuals, and that kind of raised the stakes quite considerably in terms of the investment required to succeed. But the clubs, were basically 100% dependent upon that one individual and their willingness to continue to pump money in, because they generally lose money from a P&L perspective in terms of the operations of the club. And also, where that money came from. In many cases, it was, quite dubious sources. And there are so many clubs where it didn't end very well. And so the shift, I think, to institutional investors, I think raises the level of professionalism and overall quality. So, if we're talking about private equity, they are also backed by other institutional investors as limited partners, be they endowments or foundations or insurance companies or pension funds. The purpose-built investment funds, which in most cases, again, are a consortia of individuals from the private equity world, in some cases, some high-profile celebrities, and even they are backed by limited partners who are institutional investors. The emergence of multinational corporations getting involved in football ownership, Red Bull being obviously the great example of that, but there are others, and of course, the sovereign wealth fund. So I think, that changing complexion, and especially as I've spent my entire career working and investing across borders, that increased globalization I find very exciting, and especially, we talked earlier about the multi-club ownership groups, but you also now have a big spike in multi-sport ownership groups, and it's, particularly the ones from the US who are owners of NFL, NBA, NHL, Major League Baseball teams. I mean, I personally find that exciting. The increased focus on women's football, I think, is another area of excitement. And I firmly believe that investors see that. And there is a huge spike in interest of institutional investors wanting to get involved in women's football. And and it's being evidenced not just by the changes on the ownership side, but the increased professionalism of the game, and the exponential growth in its revenue generation. I mean, just look at the NWSL here in the US. They just signed a new television contract for $250 million. 4 years ago, it was $4.5 million. I mean, that's a 50x increase in the values, which is why I mentioned earlier that kind of like these new owners are focused really on three areas in terms of generating revenue, which I think is really exciting.
I think it's a fascinating landscape, rather, Richard, to be a part of. And yeah, look, hopefully we can have you on again for round two, because it seems to be, the news and the landscape seems to be co-emerging and changing on what was a monthly basis, now a weekly, if not daily basis, with the news that kind of we're endeavored to on a day-to-day basis. But anyways, Richard, it was an absolute pleasure to host you on the show. But before we cut to finish, what would be your one bit of key advice for anyone listening who wants to thread a similar path to yourself?
Sorry, Connie, the Wi-Fi cut out a bit. It was a bit choppy.
Apologies. Yes. So, Richard, it's an absolute pleasure to host you on the show today. But for those people that are even that slightly bit inspired listening to you speak about your story so eloquently today, and indeed excited to see what the future of football economics holds, what would be your one bit of key advice for them be?
I mean, in my experience, I think as human beings, we always tend to excel in areas that excite us. And if you have a passion for sports and you have an acumen for business, the industry itself offers such a huge array of career development opportunities. I mean, we started a conversation talking about Soccer X, and you can get involved in the management side, you can get involved in the investment side, you can get involved in coaching, you can get involved in sports science, you can get involved in sports tech, you can get involved in architectural design. I mean, there are so many ways that you can combine, from a functional perspective, what you're good at and what you're interested at with your passion for wanting to spend your days within the world of sport. I mean, my nephew is finishing up at Boston College, and he's looking to get into sports analytics, and is studying that at a major university. And I mean, if only I had the opportunity 35 years ago to kind of combine my passion for sport with my interest in business. But I just think that the area is booming so much, and I think that you can do so. And like with anything, you have to be incredibly proactive. I think in my career, the overwhelming, and maybe I'm well, again, in some ways a bad example. I mean, 30 plus years, I've worked for 4 employers in total. So very baby boomerish. But 4 very diverse industry sectors, kind of oil and gas, and then to financial services, and then to employee benefits, and then into government. None of that wouldn't have happened. None of that would have happened. I'm getting my double negative. None of that would have happened if I hadn't kind of been proactive to identify, kind of pursue, and even self-generate my own opportunities and to kind of run with it. So, you know, if you're starting out at the beginning of your career trajectory and you have an opportunity to work in sport, even if it's something that, you know, isn't your ultimate desired point of arrival, right? If you have to start in, you know, season ticket sales or media relations or whatever, or, you know, being a kit man, do it, get in and learn the business, build your network, build your expertise, grow your relationships, and take the initiative to make things happen.
Absolutely fantastic. Richard Albert, it was an absolute pleasure to host you on the show today.
Connor, pleasure as always. Anytime. Love to do it. Could talk about this for hours, as I know you could as well.